Welcome to another session of Wednesday with Quizzes. In each session, we bring to you questions pertaining to specific quant and verbal topics tested on the GMAT. My name is Sunita and I will be your host today. Today's session is in the uses of that, and we will solve GMAT SE questions testing some of the uses of that. So let's get started. What we will learn today is uses of that as a connector, to introduce a clause, as a pronoun to replace a noun, and as a relative pronoun modifying a noun. We had released a short video lesson on the 4 uses of that earlier. The link to that video is given at the top right hand corner. Please watch that video lesson before you attempt the questions in this session to reap the maximum benefit from these questions. And do not forget to like the videos and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any such weekly lessons and sessions. Let's now get started with the first question of the day. Here's the first question. Hit the pause button while you solve this question and resume to follow through with the discussion of the solution. Thank you for solving the question. We will now follow the 3-step meaning-based approach that GMAT is so famous for. Let's analyze the original sentence first. A ruined structure found at Aqaba, Jordan. Alright, so here we are talking about a ruined structure, and found at Aqaba at Jordan is nothing else but a modifier for the noun structure. How do we know that? If we ask the question what found or who found, the structure is not the doer of the verb found. Therefore, found at Aqaba is nothing else but an ed verbal or ed modifier for ruined structure. Let's see what we are going to talk about this ruined structure. A ruined structure was probably a church. Now this is a little awkward here. Why? A ruined structure was a church. Aren't we trying to say that the structure that was ruined, that is the ruined structure was probably a church? So not quite absolutely grammatically incorrect, so to speak, but the intention clearly seems to point out a specific ruined structure and that it probably could have been a church. So let's proceed. A ruined structure was probably a church as indicated. Okay, so something indicated that this ruined structure was a church. Let us see what indicated this. As indicated in its eastward orientation. Okay, so this its is probably referring to the structure, which is the church, the structure's eastward orientation, and by its overall plan. Okay, so we have two things here which are being suggested as indicators or evidence of suggesting that the ruined structure was a church. Let's continue. As well as, okay, so here we have the phrase as well as, and it's clearly joining something mentioned earlier with something mentioned later. Alright, so what was mentioned earlier? Two pieces of evidence: in its eastward orientation and by its overall plan, in both the cases the its was referring to the ruined structure, which was probably a church. However, there is a problem here. After this phrase as well as, we straight away have the noun artifacts. However, what we are trying to say here is in its eastward direction, so as indicated in its eastward orientation, by its overall plan, as well as artifacts. Or are we trying to say as well as by the artifacts such as so and so found at the site? Clearly there is a lack of parallelism because two of the pieces of evidence here are followed by prepositions, but we don't have the preposition here. So what we have been trying to say clearly is a ruined structure was found at Aqaba in Jordan. This structure had probably been a church, and the evidence to support this probability are the structure's eastward orientation and overall plan, as well as the artifacts found at the site. So we have been able to raise two red flags. One, the awkward construction. Two, the lack of parallelism. Let us see how these get sorted. Clearly, the original sentence has errors. So, choice A, as pointed out in the earlier step, is incorrect because of the two reasons. One, the awkward construction of a ruined structure was a church instead of saying the ruined structure was probably a church. And the second reason being the lack of parallelism as indicated by the missing preposition before artifacts. Let us now eliminate the other choices. So here's choice B. Let us read it. A ruined structure found at Aqaba, Jordan. Okay, once again we have the awkward a ruined structure and a church here. Once probably being a church. Now notice how this once probably being a church is put within two commas. It's a modifier for this structure and it has been treated as a non-essential modifier, not important modifier, something that we can do without. So what we are really saying is a ruined structure was indicated by its eastward orientation, overall plan, and artifacts. That's illogical. The meaning is totally changed. The structure was not indicated. That the structure was a church was indicated by certain evidence. So if we remove the non-essential modifier from the sentence, this is what our sentence will look like. A ruined structure was indicated by its orientation, by its overall plan, and by its artifacts. So the parallelism issue is corrected by the use of and we can take the by its as common. However, the meaning is totally out of place. So B is incorrect. Let us now move to choice C. In choice C, we can see there is a total change in structure, indicating that, okay, so the sentence starts with something is indicating something, indicating that a ruined structure found at Aqaba, Jordan was probably a church. So what is indicating that a ruined structure found at Aqaba was probably a church? Indicating this were, well now this is plural, were its eastward orientation and overall plan. Alright, so eastward orientation and overall plan are the subject and the verb here is were, which is fine. What we are saying is the structure's eastward orientation and overall plan were indicating that a ruined structure found at Aqaba was probably a church. But then the usage of but also here is quite out of place. We know that but also is justified when there is a not only as well. So indicating something were X and Y, which is okay, but also Z is incorrect. So C is ruled out. Let's now move to choice D. A ruined structure found at Aqaba, Jordan was probably a church. Now that awkwardness still remains, but we might kind of settle with that if all else is fine. So a ruined structure was probably a church as indicates. Indicates here clearly is a verb. So what is the subject? As indicates is its eastward orientation and overall plan. Okay, so the subject here is eastward orientation. But wait, we have another subject here added by this and. So what we have really is indicates is a singular verb, but the subject of this verb is what? The subject is plural. And therefore clearly there is a subject verb agreement error here above all else. So this is also out. Let's now move to choice, the last choice that is. Since we have successfully eliminated all the choices with proper reasoning, what remains must be correct. However, let us discuss in what way is it correct. That, now we are starting off with that here. And even before you read this sentence, if you have already watched the video lesson on the uses of that, you would know that we can use that to introduce a clause as the subject of the sentence. Let us see if that is so. That a ruined structure found at Aqaba, Jordan. Okay, so we are saying that a ruined structure was probably a church is indicated. by its eastward orientation and overall plan, as well as by the artifacts found at the site. Alright, so clearly here, the by here is introducing these two pieces of evidence, and after as well as we have by introducing another piece of evidence found at the site, which is absolutely fine. Okay, so clearly here, the that is introducing the clause as the subject of this sentence. What is that clause? A ruined structure was probably a church. As stated earlier, a little bit awkward here, but the introduction of that kind of rules out that awkwardness. How? When we say that a ruined structure was probably a church, we are in fact saying the fact that. Notice how this the removes the awkwardness of this a here. So you were saying the fact that a structure was a church is indicated by something as well as by something. And it definitely corrects all the red flags that we had raised earlier. And this is the correct choice. So what is the takeaway here? The takeaway here is that that can be used to introduce a clause as the subject of the sentence. Additionally, we also need to remember that whenever the clause is the subject of the sentence, then the verb of that subject is always singular, as we have already seen in this case. Let us now look at the second question. Here's the second question. Hit the pause button as you attempt this question and resume to follow through with the discussion of the solution. Lacking information about energy use. Clearly, this ing verbal phrase here is modifying the people. So people are lacking information about energy use. Okay. Then what? These people tend to overestimate something. Okay, so overestimate here is the verb and people is the subject. People overestimate what? They have the tendency to overestimate what? The amount of energy used by equipment such as lights. Okay, so such as lights is an example of the kind of equipment that people overestimate the amount of energy used by. Alright, so we can clearly strike this off as non-essential information. And what we have now at hand is people overestimate how much energy is used by equipment that are visible. How do we know that that are visible is referring to equipment? Remember, non-essential information needs to be struck off and your sentence must be making sense without that information. So this that here, which is a relative pronoun clause, is modifying the nearest noun equipment. Equipment that are visible. Subject equipment, verb are. Clearly we have a subject verb error here. They do not agree in number. Equipment is singular. R is plural. It should have been amount of energy used by equipment that is visible and that must be turned on and off. So what we are really saying is people do not have a correct estimate of the amount of energy that is used by equipment that people can see and that people need to turn on and off. Okay. So we've already got one red flag. And now clearly since we have and here, there must be another clause which is parallel to the previous clause. And underestimate. Okay, so people overestimate and people underestimate. All right, so here is the verb for another verb for people. And what do they underestimate? They underestimate that. So this that is clearly a replacement for a noun mentioned earlier. Which noun? Per the logic and parallelism, if they overestimate the amount of energy, then they also underestimate the amount of energy. And which amount of energy this time? Used by unobtrusive equipment. Okay, so earlier we had amount of energy used by visible equipment. This time we are talking about underestimating the amount of energy used by unnoticeable equipment such as water heaters. You kind of can get the picture, you know. We can see the light as we enter the room, we can see the fans, and we know that we need to switch it on and off, and so we think that they are consuming a lot of energy. But when you switch on the water heater in the bathroom, you probably never think how much of energy it is consuming, because you're not really looking at it directly all the time. Good. So clearly here, the second that is definitely fine, but this that is kind of correct in terms of its usage, but the R is incorrect. What we really therefore want to say is people lack information about energy use, and so they overestimate the amount of energy used by equipment that we can see and have to turn on and off, and they underestimate the amount of energy used by equipment that we don't notice, that is unobtrusive equipment. Fair enough. Let us now eliminate the other choices and choose the correct one. So choice A we have already ruled out, because equipment that are visible kind of violates the rule of subject verb pair should agree in number. So A is out. Let us move on to B. Fitting B into the original sentence, we can see that we are now talking about, once again, we are talking about equipment that are visible. So this is again incorrect. In the exam, you actually don't need to look further, but since we are at the learning stage, let us eliminate the choice if there are any other options as errors as well. So equipment that are visible and must be turned on and off, and underestimate it when. Now these are two additions to the original sentence, and whenever something is added to your original sentence, you must be on the alert. So clearly this is one error. The antecedent of it is not clear. Why is it not clear? Well, you see, it could be referring to equipment, which is also singular. It could be referring to amount. It could be referring to energy. So not really very clear here. It is not as clear as the that was in the original sentence. Also, a bigger error is the when. It implies as if people underestimate the amount of energy used exactly at the moment when the energy is being used. It's like I have switched on the water heater, and at that moment I am underestimating. I'm standing there in the bathroom and underestimating the energy that the water heater must be using. Sounds weird, right? So definitely B is out. It is not only illogical, it is outrightly incorrect because of the R visible. Let's move on to the next choice. Now choice C corrects the error of subject verb agreement. Now we are saying equipment that is visible, fair enough, this is fine, and must be turned on and off, and underestimate it and when. So these two issues are the same as was present in choice B. So we can clearly rule it out. Let's move to the next choice. Let's fit this into the original sentence. The amount of energy used by visible equipment. Aha! Now the use of visible equipment as compared to equipment that is visible is clearly more concise. And we do know that GMAT SC questions which are correct are more on the concise side. GMAT favors conciseness. So let's watch out for this. Visible equipment that must be turned on and off, and underestimate that here is referring to the amount of energy as discussed earlier. Okay, so this makes sense. People overestimate the amount of energy used by visible equipment and underestimate the amount of energy used by unobtrusive equipment. All right, so this makes total sense. Great. So D kind of is more concise. The that is used as the correct pronoun to replace the noun phrase amount of energy. It's replacing the entire phrase. Yes, guys, that when replacing a noun can replace a single noun or can replace an entire noun phrase. How do we check that that is replacing the correct noun phrase? You can replace the that with the noun or noun phrase you think it is referring to and check for the error. or check for the correctness, as we have done in this case. People tend to overestimate the amount of energy used by visible equipment and underestimate the amount of energy used by unobtrusive equipment, that is unnoticeable equipment. D is absolutely right on all counts. Let us now see if we can surely eliminate the last choice remaining. In E2, we see that visible equipment has been introduced, which is concise. That must be turned on and off is also fine, but the issue that we had in the earlier choices is still there, and therefore E can be eliminated quickly. What is the takeaway from this question? The takeaway is that when that is used as a pronoun to replace a noun or noun phrase, it must make sense. It must be logical. So to check for the correct usage of that, in such cases, you replace the that with the noun or pronoun, the noun or noun phrase that you think is logically being referred to by that. Something like this. Say we have a sentence like, some critics have compared Lord Byron's satirical style to that of his contemporary P.B. Shelley. Now here this that is referring to what? You would think, okay, the only noun that I have is satirical style, the noun phrase, sorry. Let us see if this makes sense. And when you replace it, you have, some critics have compared Lord Byron's satirical style to the satirical style of his contemporary P.B. Shelley, and this is totally fine. Therefore, this is correct. So that is used as a pronoun to completely replace a noun or a noun phrase. Let us now move to the last question of the session. Here's the last question. Hit the pause button while you attempt this question and resume to follow through with the discussion. Let's read together. A new test for AIDS has proved helpful. Okay, so the subject here is a new test for AIDS, and this has proved helpful. So we're talking about the quality of this test, the ability of this test. And whenever we talk about the ability of a noun, we always use a prepositional phrase to introduce that. And we rightfully have in eliminating here. So a new test has proved helpful in eliminating something. Eliminating what? Eliminating the blood. Okay. Contaminated with the virus. Now, contaminated here is an ed verbal, and we can see that it is placed between two commas. Meaning wise, we know that we are talking about what is contaminated with the virus? This blood, since ed verbals modify the nearest nouns. So we are talking about this new test for AIDS. It has proved helpful in removing blood which is contaminated with the virus. This the virus probably refers to the AIDS virus. Okay, let's read further. From the nation's blood supply. Alright, so what we are saying is that this test can maybe screen the nation's blood supply, and it can eliminate the contaminated blood from this total blood supply. However, there is a problem here. What is that problem? We know that information modifiers, that is placed within two commas, are non-essential modifiers, and our sentence must make sense even when we remove this additional piece of information. So when we strike this out, what remains is a little bit nonsensical. What remains? Now we are saying a new test for AIDS has proved helpful in eliminating blood from the nation's blood supply. So are we saying all the blood from the blood supply? That would mean nothing will remain in that blood supply, and of course that is not the intended meaning, right? This is totally illogical. The intended meaning seems to be that a new test for AIDS has proved helpful. It has proved helpful in eliminating the virus contaminated blood, and this virus contaminated blood they are eliminating from the nation's blood supply, probably blood banks and so on and so forth. Alright, so let us see which sentence conveys this meaning correctly. What has happened here is contaminated with the virus was supposed to be a very important essential piece of information. However, it has been treated as a non-essential piece of information. Let us see which sentence puts this correct. So A is incorrect as stated earlier. Why is it incorrect? It is incorrect because essential information has been provided as non-essential information, and which makes the sentence illogical. We are not eliminating all the blood from the blood supply of the nation. So A is out. Let's move to the next choice. Now a lot of you may have marked this as a correct answer choice. However, there is a small catch. We here are saying in eliminating blood from the nation's blood supply that is contaminated with the virus. Now that is contaminated with the virus here is a relative pronoun clause. And most of the time people believe that this relative pronoun clause can refer to the nearest noun. Now here we need to remember that it can not only refer to the nearest noun that it is touching, it can also refer to a noun which is separated from that by a prepositional phrase. What do we really have here? We have eliminating blood from the nation's blood supply. Now from the nation's blood supply is a prepositional phrase which ends in a noun, and you have another noun at the head of that phrase. Technically speaking, this that can refer to the nearest noun. It can also jump over the prepositional phrase to refer to the head noun. However, it cannot refer to both at the same time. This construction is creating an ambiguity. Alright, what is that ambiguity? Are we saying blood that is contaminated with the virus, which is correct? Or are we saying the nation's blood supply that is contaminated with the virus? Clearly not the intended meaning. So B is out. The learning here is relative pronoun clauses can jump over small prepositional phrases to refer to the head noun of that particular noun phrase. Let's move to the next choice. Now a lot of you may not have liked the construction of C. Why? Because instead of straight away saying in eliminating blood, you have the phrase in eliminating from the nation's blood supply moved from the end of the sentence right next to in eliminating, and a lot of you might find that incorrect. However, the rest of it is correct. We are saying that the new test has proved helpful in eliminating what? Blood. And this blood that is contaminated with the virus. From where are we eliminating that? From the nation's blood supply. So from the nation's blood supply, which is telling us from where the elimination has taken place, is being brought ahead. Does that violate any rule? Not really. Just that we wouldn't normally write like this. But the information provided in the sentence is very clear. The test has proved helpful in eliminating from where? The nation's blood supply. In eliminating what? Blood. Which blood? That is contaminated with the virus. Actually, C is correct. However, in the exam, you might want to hold on to such a question, which although is not per what you would want it to be, but definitely provides the information clearly. Let's move to the next choice. Right away we have a change, and as stated earlier, all changes must be taken into account. Instead of saying in eliminating, we are saying to eliminate. What is the difference? Now the to verbal, okay, is used either to modify a verb to show the intention of that verb, or to modify a noun to show the intention of that noun. However, in this case, we are talking about the quality of the noun. We are talking about the quality or ability of the test. And whenever you want to provide the quality or ability of a noun, you should use a prepositional phrase instead of a to verbal. This is how GMAT uses the prepositional phrase to tell us about the quality of a noun. Alright, so clearly here, to eliminate is a big time error. Alright, also, if you look closely, from the nation's blood supply is a prepositional phrase, and it is placed next to the noun virus. People who are reading this sentence for the first time might actually think that the virus is coming from the nation's blood supply, which is definitely what the original sentence was not trying to convey. And that creates an error as well. So here we have got two red flags. One, the to eliminate does not correctly reflect the ability of the test. Secondly, it sounds as if the virus is from the nation's blood supply. The original sentence did not tell us where the virus came from. However, if you see blood that is contaminated with the virus is okay. So D is also out. A lot of you might have chosen D, just because you got the error that you were looking out for. Okay, blood that is contaminated with virus. But as I told you earlier, any changes that you notice, always take those into account. See if that is changing the meaning of the overall sentence or not. Let us now move to the last choice. Again, we have the same error as D, to eliminate blood from the nation's blood supply that is contaminated. And again, here we have the error we had in choice B. That is stationed such that it could be referring to any of these two nouns separated by a prepositional phrase, which is also wrong. So E is also out. What is the takeaway from this question? The takeaway is that is used as a relative pronoun to provide important or essential information about that noun. In the absence of such information, the sentence would not make sense. We have discussed the difference between that as a relative pronoun using introducing essential information, and which is also relative pronoun. However, it is used to introduce non-essential information. You can watch the video that we released last week, and the link of that video we shared with you earlier on in this session when we began the session. So let us now understand that as a relative pronoun can modify two things, but not at the same time. Either the noun it touches, for example, the dogs on streets that are unlit often lurk in the shadows. Here the subject is the dogs, and on the streets is just modifying the dogs. It's a prepositional phrase. That are unlit. Now that are unlit here can only logically refer to streets. The dogs can't be unlit, right? So that are unlit clearly makes sense only with streets, and therefore there is no ambiguity here. And here that is clearly referring to streets, not to dogs. That can also refer to a noun which is separated from that by a prepositional phrase. The dog with dark spots. Okay, so with dark spots here is modifying dog. And spots here is also a noun, but spots cannot bark, right? So clearly here that barks is making sense only with dog and not with spots, and therefore there is no ambiguity here. And this that can jump over the prepositional phrase and refer to dog. It is not referring to spots. As long as this clarity is there, the usage of that is correct. So you need to look out for this. So what we've learned in today's session is how that can be used to introduce a clause as the subject of the sentence, how that can be correctly used to replace a noun mentioned earlier in the sentence or a noun phrase mentioned earlier in the sentence. And we have also seen the correct usage of that as a relative pronoun clause, providing essential information about a noun. With that, we come to the end of the session. Please like and subscribe to our channel if you found this useful. Happy learning till then. Thank you very much for attending this.